The moment that changed everything didn't happen in a dramatic confrontation or a late-night argument. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in our daughter's childhood bedroom, while I was looking for old family photographs. Sophie's wedding was 6 days away. She'd asked me to find the album from her 5th birthday, the one with the pictures of her in the yellow dress, the one Claire and I had laughed about for years because Sophie had insisted on wearing it despite the fact that it was 2 sizes too small and she looked, as Claire always said, like a very determined little sausage. I was smiling at the memory when I reached under the bed and pulled out the old tablet. It wasn't mine. I recognized it immediately, the cracked corner of the case, the faded sticker Sophie had put on it years ago. Claire had used it briefly a few years back before upgrading, and it had migrated under the bed the way objects do in a house with a teenager. I turned it on thinking it might have the photos synced from Claire's old account. It did have photos. And it had emails. And it had messages. I sat on the edge of Sophie's childhood bed, surrounded by the faint smell of old carpet and the particular stillness of a room that hadn't been lived in for 2 years, and I read things that rearranged the last several years of my life into a shape I didn't recognize. I put the tablet face down on the mattress and sat there for a long time without moving. 25 years. That was the number that kept surfacing. Not the names in the emails, not the specific words, not the hotel reservation confirmations with their neat date stamps. Just the number. 25 years of mornings and arguments and reconciliations and grocery lists and holidays, and the particular intimacy of knowing another person so completely that you stop seeing them clearly. 25 years, and I had been sitting in the dark. I'm Daniel. I was, at the time of that Sunday afternoon, a man who believed, genuinely, without reservation, that his marriage was one of the stable things. Not perfect. We'd had our difficulties, our seasons of distance, our disagreements that took too long to resolve. But stable. Foundational. The thing you built other things on. I worked in architectural consulting, fitting, perhaps, for a man who spent his professional life assessing the structural integrity of things. I was good at spotting stress fractures in buildings. It turned out I was considerably less skilled at spotting them in marriages. Claire and I had met in our early 20s at a mutual friend's dinner party. She had been the one talking the most and the one listening the most carefully, a combination I'd never encountered before and found immediately compelling. We married 2 years later. Sophie arrived 3 years after that, and the life we built around her was, I thought, the best evidence of what Claire and I were capable of together. Sophie was getting married on Saturday. To Ryan, a quietly decent young man who adored her with an uncomplicated sincerity that I found deeply reassuring. The wedding had consumed the last 6 months of our household. Venue, catering, flowers, the seating chart that Claire had revised 11 times. She'd thrown herself into the planning with an energy I'd read as love for our daughter. I understand now that it was also distraction. And possibly, in some part one don't like to think about too carefully, a performance of the devoted mother and wife, a role she was preparing to step out of, or had perhaps already stepped out of, while maintaining the costume. The tablet showed me the first email from Mr. Caldwell dated 14 months ago. The most recent was 3 weeks before that Sunday afternoon. 14 months. I picked up the tablet again and made myself read everything from beginning to end. Not because I wanted to. Because I needed the full picture before I decided anything, a professional habit so deeply ingrained it operated even through shock. Observe, document, understand before you move. By the time I finished it was dark outside. I could hear Claire downstairs, moving around the kitchen, the familiar sounds of dinner being prepared. The smell of something with garlic drifted up the stairs. Ordinary. Domestic. Entirely intact on the surface. I put the tablet in my jacket pocket and went downstairs. I didn't say anything that evening. I set the table and ate dinner and asked Claire about the florist and listened to her answer and said the right things at the right moments, and the entire time I felt as though I were watching the scene from a slight distance, present in body, somewhere else entirely in mind. She was animated at dinner. The wedding preparations gave her a natural script, an endless supply of logistical detail that filled conversation without requiring depth. I had been grateful for that script over the past months. I understood now why she'd been grateful for it too. Looking back with the clarity that only comes after everything has been confirmed, the signs had been accumulating for longer than 14 months. I had simply been filing them under the wrong category. It had started, or rather, I had first noticed, about 2 years ago. Claire had been promoted to senior director at Harrington and Vale, the financial consultancy where she'd worked for 11 years. The promotion came with expanded responsibilities and a closer working relationship with the firm's founding partner, Mr. Caldwell. She mentioned him often in those early months. Caldwell thinks we should approach the Meridian account differently. Caldwell is pushing for the new software rollout. Caldwell suggested I lead the Geneva presentation. I had listened to these references with the mild interest of a husband hearing about his wife's professional world, registering the name, not the frequency. Not the way a name repeated that often stops being background noise and starts being something else. That was the first red flag I walked past without stopping. His name in our kitchen, at our dinner table, in the margins of our ordinary conversations, and I heard it as career talk. I should have heard it as something closer. The late evenings came next. Not immediately, not in a pattern I recognized as a pattern, gradually, the way water finds its level. 3 nights a week became 4. 4 became 5. She always had a reason, and the reasons were always plausible: a deadline, a client call across time zones, a presentation that needed reworking. I was working long hours myself that year on a major project, and the symmetry made it easier not to question. What I didn't register, what I assembled only much later, piece by piece, was the quality of her distraction. Claire had always been present in a particular way, even when she was tired. She engaged. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered things I'd mentioned in passing and circled back to them days later. That quality of attention was one of the things I'd loved most about her. Sometime in the past 2 years, it had quietly disappeared. I didn't ask where it had gone. I told myself it was the pressure of the new role. I told myself that long marriages had seasons, that this was simply a cooler one, that we would find our way back to warmth when the work pressure eased. I was so committed to this explanation that I actively resisted evidence against it. There was an evening, perhaps 8 months before that Sunday, when I came home to find Claire standing in the garden with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low, rapid voice that stopped the moment she heard the back door. She turned, saw me, and the expression on her face, just for a fraction of a second, before the familiar composure settled back, was something I had never seen there before. Not guilt, exactly. More like the look of someone who has been briefly visible in a way they hadn't intended. She said she'd been talking to her sister about the wedding budget. I said fine. I went inside and poured myself a drink. I didn't believe her. That's what I've had to sit with since. I didn't believe her in that moment. I felt it clearly, and I chose, consciously, to accept the explanation anyway. Because the alternative required more from me than I was prepared to give that evening. The physical distance had grown too, though I'd resisted naming it. Not hostility, nothing so clear as that. Just a gradual withdrawal of the small spontaneous gestures that mark genuine intimacy. The hand on the shoulder passing in the kitchen, the leaning in during a shared film, the particular way she used to find my hand under the table at dinner parties. These things had faded so incrementally that there was no single moment I could point to and say, here, this is when it changed. It had changed the way light changes in autumn, imperceptibly, until one day you notice it's dark an hour earlier, and you wonder how you didn't see it coming. Sophie noticed, in her way. 2 months before the wedding, she asked me quietly whether everything was okay between her mother and me. I told her we were both just tired from the planning. She accepted that with the particular patience of an adult child who has learned not to push. But she had asked? And the fact that she'd asked meant she'd seen something I'd been telling myself wasn't visible. The tablet changed the quality of my attention entirely. I went through the following days: the final preparations for Sophie's wedding, the arrival of relatives, the rehearsal dinner, with a surface calm that I maintained through what I can only describe as deliberate professional focus. I had observed the problem. I was now in the documentation phase. I would not move until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. What the tablet had shown me was 14 months of correspondence between Claire and Mr. Caldwell, whose first name, I learned, was Jeffrey. The early emails were professionally toned but warmer than they needed to be. By the third month they had crossed a line that left no room for interpretation. The hotel reservations, 4 of them, all in the city, all on evenings when Claire had been working late, were booked under Caldwell's corporate account. There were photographs. I will not describe them in detail, because the details don't matter and because even now, some distance later, they retain a particular capacity to hurt. What mattered, what I focused on, with the trained attention of someone who has spent a career assessing damage, was the timeline and the pattern. The pattern told me this had not been a moment of weakness. It had been a sustained choice, made repeatedly over more than a year, protected by a careful architecture of explanations and routines. Claire had not stumbled into something. She had built something, maintained it, and kept it running in parallel with our life together. I said nothing to Claire. I kept the tablet in the inside pocket of my winter coat, hanging in the back of the wardrobe where she never went. I reviewed its contents once more and then left it there. On Wednesday, 3 days before the wedding, I called Patricia. I had known Patricia professionally for several years. She handled contracts for a firm that occasionally collaborated with mine. I knew her as methodical, direct, and entirely without sentimentality. I told her I needed to speak to her urgently and privately, not about a building project. She understood the shift in register immediately and gave me an appointment for the following morning. I told her everything I knew. She listened without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, and then told me what I needed to do and in what order. Before anything else, she said, I need you to understand that you are not going to confront her this week. Not before the wedding. I had already made that decision, but hearing it stated confirmed it. Sophie's wedding would not become the backdrop for the end of her parents' marriage. Whatever happened between Claire and me, it would happen after Sophie and Ryan had their day, clean, undamaged, exactly as they'd planned it. Document everything on that tablet, Patricia said. And I want you to pull together a picture of your joint finances, accounts, investments, property. Everything. Before she has any indication, you know. That evening I sat in my home office for 3 hours going through our financial records. What I found added a dimension I hadn't anticipated, though perhaps should have. Over the preceding 8 months, Claire had made a series of transfers from our joint investment account to a personal account I hadn't known existed. The amounts were not enormous individually, between $2,000 and $4,000 each time, but they totaled just under $30,000. The account had been opened in her name alone. I sat with that information for a long time. Something shifted in me that night that had nothing to do with the affair. The financial transfers told a different story, not of passion or loneliness or whatever narrative Claire would eventually construct to explain Caldwell. They told the story of preparation. Of a woman who had been, quietly and methodically, building a separate foundation while standing on the shared one. That was the moment I stopped grieving and started thinking clearly. The rehearsal dinner was on Thursday evening, a private room at a restaurant near the venue, 22 people, good wine, toasts that made Sophie cry in the best possible way. I watched Claire across the table and tried to locate, somewhere behind what I now knew, the woman I had married. She was charming that evening. Attentive to Sophie, warm with Ryan's parents, funny in the particular dry way she had that I had always loved. She was also, I noticed, on her phone twice during dinner, tilting the screen away from the table in a gesture so practiced it barely registered as deliberate. Ryan's mother leaned over at one point and told me what a wonderful family we had built. I thanked her and meant it, because we had. Whatever Claire had done, we had built something real. That was the grief underneath the anger, not the loss of an illusion, but the partial loss of something that had actually existed. Something that had been genuine and was now irreparably complicated. The morning of Sophie's wedding I woke at 5:45 and lay in the great pre-dawn light listening to Claire breathe beside me with the particular steadiness of someone who sleeps well. I had not slept well in 5 days. I had lain beside her each night in a silence that felt to me enormous and apparently registered to her as nothing. I got up quietly and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the garden come into the light. In 6 hours, my daughter would walk down an aisle. In Patricia's office there was a file I was building. In the wardrobe upstairs was a tablet that had already told me everything I needed to know, and several things I hadn't wanted to. The question was no longer what. The what was documented and confirmed. The question was how and when. How to end 25 years with the least collateral damage to Sophie, to Ryan, to the life we had built that deserved to be dismantled with care rather than rage. When to have the conversation that would make everything that came before it permanently conditional. Patricia had advised me clearly: secure the financial documentation first, initiate the legal process quietly, do not confront until the legal framework was in place. You confront before you're protected, she had said, and you lose control of the timeline. I had followed her advice. The documentation was complete. The financial transfers had been reported to Patricia with full records. A post-nuptial agreement, drafted to protect my share of our joint assets in the event of separation, was ready and waiting. I had signed my copy. Claire's signature was the remaining piece. I had also, in the preceding days, made 2 calls that expanded the picture further. The first was to a colleague of Claire's, a woman named Barbara who had worked at Harrington and Vale for years and who I'd always liked. I framed my call carefully, asking only about the firm's recent restructuring, which had been reported in the business press. Barbara mentioned, without my prompting, that Mr. Caldwell had been spending considerably less time in the office recently. Personal matters, she said in the tone people use when personal matters are an open secret. The second call was to our bank, requesting a full statement history for the joint investment account going back 18 months. The statements arrived by secure email the following afternoon and confirmed what I'd already calculated from the online records. Patricia had the full package. What I hadn't anticipated was the wedding toast. Sophie had asked both Claire and me to speak. I had prepared something short and honest, about watching a child become a person, about the particular pride of standing beside them at the threshold of their own life. I had written it out and practiced it twice and felt, delivering it that afternoon in the golden afternoon light of the venue, that it was true in every word. Claire spoke after me. She stood with her glass and looked at Sophie with an expression of genuine love. I don't doubt that part. I have never doubted Claire's love for our daughter, and she said things that were beautiful and appropriate. And then, near the end, she said something that made me go very still. Sophie, the most important thing I can tell you about a long marriage is that people are complicated. We disappoint each other. We make choices we're not proud of. What matters, the only thing that matters, is whether you find your way back to each other. She paused. She looked down at her glass for a moment. I hope you and Ryan always find your way back. She raised her glass. The room raised their glasses. Sophie was crying. Ryan had his arm around her. I held my glass and looked at my wife and understood that she had just confessed, not to anyone else in that room, but to me, and to herself. Wrapped in the language of wisdom and maternal love, she had stood at our daughter's wedding and acknowledged what she had done. Not as an admission. As a kind of plea. Even now, that moment sits differently than the rest. The emails were a betrayal. The financial transfers were a calculation. But the toast, that was something else. That was a woman standing at the edge of what she'd done and asking, in the only language available to her in that moment, whether there was still a way back. I didn't have an answer for her then. I'm not sure I have one now that doesn't cost more than I'm willing to pay. I waited until Monday. Sophie and Ryan left Sunday morning for their honeymoon, 2 weeks in Portugal, sun-soaked and entirely deserved. I hugged my daughter for a long time at the airport and told her I was proud of her and meant every syllable. She looked at me with the particular seeing-through quality she had always had and said quietly, "Are you okay, Dad?" I told her I was fine. I would tell her the truth when she returned, in the careful, partial way that protects children, even adult ones, from the full weight of their parents' failures. Monday morning. Claire came downstairs to find me already at the kitchen table with my coffee, the post-nuptial agreement in front of me, and the tablet beside it. She saw the tablet first. I watched the recognition move across her face, the cracked case, the faded sticker, and saw the precise moment she understood that the conversation she had been either dreading or preparing for had arrived. She sat down slowly, without being asked. "How long have you had it?" she said. "Since the Sunday before the wedding." Something moved through her expression, relief, I think, and grief, and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been permitted to set it down. "Daniel, I've read everything," I said. "I'm not going to ask you to explain it. I have everything I need. What I need from you now is to read this." I slid the postnuptial agreement across the table. She looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" "It protects both of us. It documents our assets as they currently stand and establishes a fair framework for separation. Patricia drafted it. You've already..." She stopped. "You hired a lawyer?" "Before the wedding, yes." The composure she'd held for the first minute of the conversation began to fracture. Not into anger, into something rawer. "Daniel, I know what I did. I know how wrong it was. But 25 years, you're not going to let me..." "Say it," I said. Not harshly. Evenly. "Say what you want to ask me." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to try to fix this. I ended it with Jeffrey. 3 weeks ago. I ended it, and I've been trying to find a way to tell you. I wanted to tell you after the wedding. I was going to. The financial transfers," I said. She stopped. $30,000 over 8 months. Into an account in your name. Patricia has the full documentation." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Heavier. She had come into the conversation with a version prepared, remorseful, willing to work, asking for time. The financial question removed the floor from under that version. "That was..." She started, and then stopped again, because there was no explanation that would hold. "You were preparing to leave," I said. "Or preparing for the possibility. Either way, it happened while we were living together, while I thought we were building towards something. While Sophie was planning her wedding and asking her mother for advice about marriage." Claire put her face in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense. I felt invisible. I felt like we had become functional. Like we were managing a household together rather than..." "I understand that you felt that way," I said. "I'm not dismissing it. But you chose a response to that feeling that went on for 14 months, and during those 14 months you could have talked to me, or gone to counseling, or asked for a separation directly. You chose none of those things." She had no answer for that. Because it was true, and she knew it was true, and the truth of it was more damning than any argument I could have made. She read the post-nuptial agreement. She asked 2 questions, both of which Patricia had anticipated. Then she signed it. She didn't leave that day. The practical reality of 25 years of shared life doesn't dissolve in a morning. We moved through the house carefully for the following 2 weeks, polite, restrained, the particular choreography of people navigating a space that no longer belongs to both of them in the same way. She made one more attempt at conversation, quieter than the first, less defensive, closer to genuine, in which she said things that were probably true about her loneliness and her mistakes, and what she wished she had done differently. I listened. I didn't rebuild. Patricia filed for legal separation 6 weeks after the wedding. The process was, by the standards of these things, relatively clean, aided considerably by the postnuptial agreement, which removed most of the leverage that contentious separations are usually fought over. Claire retained her personal account. The marital assets were divided according to the framework Patricia had established. The house went on the market in the spring. I told Sophie when she returned from Portugal. I chose a Sunday, the two of us at her kitchen table with tea going cold between us, and I told her as much of the truth as I judged she needed to carry without being burdened by the parts that belonged only to her parents. She cried. She asked whether there was any possibility of reconciliation. I told her honestly that I didn't think so, and I watched her process that with the particular maturity of someone who has just come from the beginning of her own marriage and understands, perhaps for the first time, what it costs. She asked if I was angry at her mother. I thought about it carefully before I answered. I was, I said. I think I'm mostly tired now. That was the truest thing I said about it for a long time. The anger had burned hottest in the weeks between finding the tablet and the wedding, contained fuel for the precision that Patricia needed from me, channeled into documentation and process rather than confrontation. By the time Claire signed the post-nuptial agreement, the anger had begun its slow conversion into something quieter and harder to name. Disappointment at its deepest register. The particular grief of having to revise a long story, not erase it, but revise it, reread everything with different knowledge and find that the events remain but the meaning shifts. I had understood something during those weeks that I carried differently now. Devotion without attention is not the same as love. I had been devoted to the work, to the structure, to the version of the marriage I believed I was maintaining. But I had stopped paying close attention somewhere along the way. That doesn't excuse what Claire did. It doesn't come close to justifying 14 months of sustained deception. But it is the part that belongs to me, and I've had to sit with it honestly. What helped, unexpectedly, was work. I returned to a major project in the autumn, a renovation assessment on a 19th-century building in the financial district, the kind of work that requires long hours of careful observation and precise documentation. I found, doing it, that I had not lost my capacity for attention. I had simply misdirected it for a long time. I had dinner with Patricia once, after the legal process concluded, in a context that was purely social. She had become, through the months of working together, something close to a friend. She said something I've thought about since. The clients who come out of this best are the ones who spend time with what they missed, not what was done to them. I asked her what she meant. The betrayal happened to you, she said. The things you didn't see, those are yours. The second one is more useful. I've been working on the second one. Sophie calls twice a week. She is building her life with Ryan with the uncomplicated energy of someone at the beginning of something, and it is one of the genuinely good things to witness. She manages the relationship with both her parents with a grace that exceeds what I could have managed at her age. Claire and I see her separately now, without coordination or conflict, which is the best outcome I could have hoped for. There are mornings when I sit in the kitchen of the apartment I rented after the house sold, smaller, quieter, overlooking a courtyard where someone has planted a fig tree that is improbably thriving, and I feel something I didn't expect to feel this side of everything. Not happiness exactly, not yet. But something adjacent to it. A sense of space. The particular lightness of a structure that has been stripped back to its load-bearing elements and found, against expectation, to be sound. 25 years is not nothing. I don't treat it as nothing. But the years that come after it are mine to build differently, with the kind of attention I should have been paying all along. What this story reveals, at its deepest level, is less about betrayal and more about the slow erosion of genuine presence in a long marriage, and the way that erosion creates the conditions for catastrophic fracture without either person fully registering what is happening until it is too late to repair. Claire's affair with Mr. Caldwell did not begin in a vacuum. It began in a marriage where two people had gradually substituted function for connection, where the household ran smoothly, the social appearances were maintained, and the deeper work of genuine emotional contact had been quietly abandoned by both parties. Daniel acknowledges this himself, with the honesty that is one of the story's most significant moments. His devotion was real. His attention had drifted. These are not equivalent failures, but they are both true simultaneously, and the story earns its complexity by holding both. What makes Claire's choices distinctly her own responsibility is not that she felt lonely or unseen. Those feelings, where genuine, are legitimate. It is that she had access to every alternative, and chose none of them. She could have initiated a direct conversation about the state of the marriage. She could have proposed counseling, or a trial separation, or simply named what she was feeling. Instead, she built a parallel life with methodical care, sustained it for over a year, and simultaneously began quietly redirecting marital funds into a private account, a detail that transforms the narrative from one of human weakness into one of deliberate calculation. The financial preparation is the element that closes the door on sympathy. It speaks not of someone swept away by feeling, but of someone managing an exit strategy while maintaining the performance of a marriage. The wedding toast is the story's most psychologically complex moment. In the language of maternal wisdom, Claire made a confession that only one person in the room could fully decode. Whether that was a subconscious surfacing of guilt, or a calculated appeal to Daniel's sense of history and loyalty, or some unresolved mixture of both, it represents the moment her carefully maintained architecture briefly showed its cracks. She had, by that point, ended the affair 3 weeks prior, according to her own account. She was, perhaps, genuinely uncertain whether there was a path back. The toast was the question she couldn't ask directly. Daniel's choice not to answer it, not to be drawn back by the emotional weight of 25 years and a daughter's wedding, is the story's moral hinge. It would have been understandable, even human, to soften in that moment. The fact that he did not is less about hardness and more about clarity. He had done the work, in the weeks between the tablet and the wedding, of understanding what had actually happened rather than what he wished had happened. That clarity is what enabled him to sit at the table on Monday morning with the postnuptial agreement and speak without rage, precisely, honestly, and without the false comfort of a reconciliation neither of them had truly earned. The recovery that follows is quieter than the conflict and more important. The fig tree in the courtyard. The work that restores his sense of his own capacity. Patricia's observation about the difference between what was done to you and what you missed, which Daniel takes seriously rather than defensively. These details are not redemption in a dramatic sense. They are the more durable thing, the slow, honest process of rebuilding on ground that has been properly assessed. If I'm honest about what sits hardest in this story, it's not the affair. Affairs happen. What sits hardest is the toast. The idea that a person could stand in front of everyone they love, on one of the most significant days of their family's life, and embed an apology, an entire confession, inside a speech about marriage, and then raise a glass and smile. Not out of cruelty. Out of the particular human capacity to hold contradictions that should be irreconcilable, and somehow keep standing. We do that. We find ways to contain what we cannot yet say directly, and we tell ourselves the container is enough. Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand that it never was.